All right, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I always say that at the beginning, but that's sort of appropriate actually today since we have people all over. I am Nick Chase from Mirantis, and welcome to today's Cloud Native and Coffee, our monthly exploration of various topics. Today it is, has cloud killed the data center? Let us introduce today's panelists. Today we start just sort of going clockwise in my monitor. Sean O'Mara, let's start with you. Introduce yourself. Give us, who you are, what you do, and one surprising fact about you.
Good morning or good day to everybody. I'm Sean O'Mara. I'm Global Field CTO for Mirantis. Surprising fact, it's an interesting one. There are plenty of them. I'm an ex-national powerlifter. So that's a little bit of background. Yeah, let's hand over to Jacob to introduce himself.
Cool. All right. Hey, Sean. So Jacob Smith, I'm currently, my title is something like VP of Strategy and Marketing for Bare Metal at Equinix. So I started a company called Packet. We got acquired by Equinix about 1.5 years ago. So running the bare metal business at Equinix. My surprising fact, I mean, it's that for 10 years I was a professional musician in the opera company. So.
Well, there you go. Wow. Okay, Adam.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Adam Parko. I'm the CTO at Mirantis. I run all of product engineering. I'd say one interesting fact about me, maybe not super interesting, but I'm a coffee espresso nut. So I brought a fancy coffee for our chat today. And I'd also like to thank Jacob for joining us today. He's a fantastic partner of ours from Equinix. I've known Jacob since I was at Docker. We've had the opportunity to work together for a couple of years now. And I want to plug our container cloud hosted trial running on his infrastructure that everyone should run out and try today. It's really cool.
Definitely. It's so nice not to have to figure out where I'm going to find a server. So yes, definitely. Thank you, Jacob. And just to kind of finish the round, I am Nick Chase. I am in charge of, I am director of technical marketing and developer relations here at Mirantis. And to follow the pattern, I used to run a radioactive waste disposal site. So there you go. So surprising.
That explains so much, Nick.
Yeah,
it explains so much. Insert glow in the dark joke here. So there you go. So all right. So let's kind of get started on the conversation. So we're talking about data centers. So what is the first server you ever racked, and where is it? I mean, we've all been around for a while, so.
I want to hear it, Sean. I want you to go first.
Oh, yeah. You're going to age me now. I've been in this game for something like 25 years. But the most interesting place that I can remember racking a server, I'll change the answer. When I joined one of the first big companies I worked for, we used to run large-scale data centers in Cape Town in South Africa. And they were in essentially nuclear-hardened bunkers underneath the main railway station in Cape Town. So underneath the what they call the international platforms. And this first 19-inch device was a router for a mainframe.
There you go.
So not technically a server, but it was in a server rack in 19.
You have a data center in a bunker. I mean, Nick knows a lot about radioactive bunkers. So
yeah, this was it was a low-level radioactive waste site. So.
All right, I'll go next because we're not sure if Adam has ever done this because Docker software, we're not so sure. I was, like I said, I was not really in the data center space until I started Packet. So 2014, I got volunteered to go to our data center in Parsippany, New Jersey, which is above the floodplain, right? That's why you go to New Jersey. And I spent a day, you lose track of time in the data center, right? You have no idea if it's light out or it's dark out.
I thought you were going to say you lose track of time in New Jersey. I come from New Jersey. I can do that. Sorry, go ahead, Jacob. You lose track of time in the data center.
We had made a change in our product. Our first server was a small little compute server, and we found out that everyone wanted, instead of 16 gigs of RAM, 32 gigs of RAM. So I took every single one of those servers out, opened them up, and put in 16 gigs of RAM. It took me like 16 hours to do it. That was my first time. So.
See, I feel really old because my only real hardware experience was when I was selling Apple IIs in the 1980s, and that was part of my job. Yes, actually in New Jersey, as it happens. And part of my job was to open them up, and when somebody bought them, and put all the pieces in. That's my hardware experience.
Apple doesn't let you do that anymore, by the way, Nick.
Yeah, they don't let. That's right, they don't let you do that anymore. But yeah, so.
I think we've lost a lot for it. I mean, I think everybody should, at some point in their life, who has to deal with infrastructure in any way, shape, or form, needs to go in and wire a rack. Put servers in a rack and plug them in, just to understand how much pain it can cause.
So
I agree.
My answer of AWS doesn't count then?
No.
It's just, we're going to think of you differently now, Adam.
No. Actually, Adam, you can leave now. We'll carry on the conversation.
Well, I mean, but that brings us to the point. But that brings us to the point. How do you define a traditional data center?
I think I'm going to take that one because the topic of the coffee chat that we're supposed to have is around, did cloud kill the data center? And I would say yes, because people don't want to think about certain things. Cloud is a value prop. Data centers are a thing. There's a lot of value in data centers. In fact, clouds are in data centers. But I think that, cloud really helped to redefine people's relationship with infrastructure. Adam's a good example of that, which is like, we're using more infrastructure than ever, more data centers than ever. We're just touching them in really different ways.
Mm-hmm.
So my answer to the big question is yes. There's all kinds of other things to talk about there. But I think it's a watershed thing. It's like, what's the experience of consuming and utilizing infrastructure? Because most people don't care about infrastructure. They care about what they can do with infrastructure. And they don't really understand maybe that it's under a highway in South Africa,
So Jacob, I don't really care. I mean, and it's interesting. I mean, you take Adam, we're going to use Adam as the example all day long here, but developers don't really have any connection anymore to the hardware that they're running the systems on. It's all, even if it is physically in a data center owned by the company, it's starting to become more and more ephemeral where we think about where processing happens. And no system is on its own anymore in a data center. It's always connected to something. And that definitely does change the way we perceive it.
Jacob, your answer was really interesting. You said that cloud did kill the data center, but that also, basically, essentially, it didn't, right? So what specifically do you think it killed, right? Was it the complexity? Was it the model or the workflow?
I think, that I'm going to just speak broadly, that people want to buy and consume data centers. That there was a phase where that was like an important part of the technology evolution, right? Like, first I'm going to own the building, maybe the company Sean worked for, and then I'm going to rent the building, and then I'm going to rent the rack, and then I'm going to rent the stuff around it, and I think that move to abstraction Sean was talking about to make it more ephemeral. It's not like I don't value the data center. Maybe I just don't see it as its own thing, right? I see it as collection or an overall value proposition, which could be for some people about totally commoditized stuff. Just give me more of it whenever I want. Or it could be I really need very special stuff. But the act of kind of layering it all together and building it or assembling each component, I think cloud really showed us a different way.
Well, I mean, but here's the question, and I say this as a developer. If you're a developer and you're requesting resources, do you really care, what that infrastructure is? And for the developers out there in the audience, tell us in the chat, do you care, or do you even know? If I'm requesting a VM, I neither know nor care whether it's in the basement of the building in which I am sitting or halfway across the country. You
care if you're whatever the architect for your GDPR compliant stuff, or your the data center. Is it
that's a good question.
Well, that begs the question: is it the data center that's dead, or is it the consumer of the resources in the data center's perception of it that's dead? That's probably a little bit of a strange way of asking the question. But
yeah, I would go with you there, Sean. I'd say that, not for everyone, right? Like there's a lot of people out there, a lot of businesses, but for many companies that are putting like digital at the front of their business, infrastructure and the things that go into infrastructure are more important to their business, not less. And so I actually, have a long-term belief that, you look at how many companies now have their finger in designing their own chips. We were talking about Apple and their closed boxes, and that's kind of an extreme example, the most valuable company in the world. But here's a car company called Tesla doing the same thing. And that's kind of interesting because, aren't we supposed to be getting away from all of it? I think for, companies that are pushing digital experiences to scale, that inevitably the value of the infrastructure gets higher, but that the experience of consuming it, you can't undo cloud, right? You can't be like, forget about all that niceness. Go back to that, Sean, make sure you get lots of pain and rack all those servers and those cables. I think that's our industry's challenge, is to deliver more value with the bar set that cloud kind of raised. Yeah.
Sure. I think on the same lines of Apple and Tesla making their own chips, right? It's around differentiation. So like, do developers care where their workloads run? I think ultimately, no and yes. No, like, they don't really care how it's run, or like, it's physically well, let me preface that physically they do as well, but really what they're looking for is differentiation. So for example, with Equinix, right, can you get closer to your user, right? Can you have like a lower latency, right? Or for Google, do they have a better like AI ML platform, right? So people are going to always care and want to use the best services to fit their needs, right? But ultimately, maybe they don't really care how it gets there or like where it is, long as their conditions like are met.
Well, that's interesting, because you both just mentioned cars, which begs the question: what is a data? Do we define the data center potentially as the car? Because the car is a self-contained computing system. Yes, it's mobile.
Very portable data center.
It's a very portable data center. So at the end of the day, of course, the developer cares that it's running in the car, because, well, if that function isn't running in the car, it's not operating on that vehicle. What do developers care about at the end of the day when it comes to this picture of the data center?
You think of Skynet and Terminator or whatever, right? Like the idea that devices, computers, what's the cloud? Someone else's computer, right? And so the sense of who is maybe owning and operating it is maybe at the root of cloud experience versus like the just care or not care about what it is. I think that that's a phase, especially where cloud unleashed, you used to have to beg and ask and buy from the IT department to get infrastructure. And then, look what cloud does. Like, actually, I don't have to do that anymore. And there's a whole like innovation layer that just got opened up. And I think that's super exciting, because there's a whole new group of people who are building stuff right on top of infrastructure.
Yeah, so it's making it accessible. It's basically, it's that idea that anybody can get access to resources now. Other people can care about how those resources are delivered and how we function. There's still a layer in between that typical developer and the infrastructure, which is your architect or your DevOps team that's taking responsibility for the distribution of that.
Kind of the consumerization of everything, right? Like taxis or movies, or everything gets kind of like delivered differently than it did, but then it's really hard to go backwards on that consumer experience. And B2B technology is getting consumerized dramatically, in that way.
Yeah, sure. We have some people who did answer in the chat. Like one person said,
"You want to stop talking all the time, Nick? Come on."
No. I wanna just kind of feed the conversation, but it's they're talking about what we're talking about, and so like where one person says, yes, I know all the VMs we have, but then I'm on the upside. Another person says, I would say I would not care as long as the data center meets the need and compliance. But what occurs to me, kind of going back, going through this, as we're going through this conversation, I remember the early days of private cloud when we talked about shadow IT and people, and all these developers who were going out and, it's like, oh God, I just need a server. And they pull out their credit card and, they go, and God knows where they go. So, where are we on kind of preventing that kind of thing?
I mean, that's a cultural thing that I think businesses are adapting to it as a service, right? They're trying to make it simpler for people to adopt. And I always like to say like product-led growth to me is, and I'm a marketer now, sorry, that's what I do. So yikes. But like product-led growth is about adopting before you really transact. I mean, you spend money along the way, but you're really adopting the product before you really buy the product. And a sales-led motion is traditionally, you buy the product and then you adopt it. And I think that that's an important strategy. Infrastructure happens to be expensive, and so it's a little bit harder to be like, try my stuff, like there's a lot of cost to these things, but there's still a model there that says like, I got to learn what it can do. I got to know what it could, how it responds, and all this sort of other, compliance, how fast is it, all the stuff that might make your decision go is happening at the earlier side, is happening faster. And so I don't know if you want to stop shadow IT so much as you want to understand the need of software developers and how they think. There's a great book about Ask Your Developer, if everyone's read, Jeff Lawson's book, CEO of Twilio. And it's a great, if you don't know how to explain like software developers to your boss, like buy that book and give it to him or her. But it's really great, great primer, because it's like thinking, software mentality is about creativity and innovation as much as it is about like producing code.
Sure.
And how do you innovate and create when you can't experiment and try and do,
I was gonna say shadow IT originates from like a need unmet, right? So the more convenient and the more easy and the more like accessible we make things, right? Especially like, again, with considering the data centers and being able to get compute, how and where you need it, I think there will be less and less shadow IT because it's just easier, right? In the past, like you said, begging and pleading to try to get, servers, I think that's kind of like on the way out, right? Giving developers more like,
for sure.
Yeah, it's more on developer focus, right? That's what Mirantis is all about.
Yeah, but it's still interesting. If you take the developer focus, and yes, we're saying we want developers to be innovative. We want to have the opportunity to create greater amounts of code and deliver more value, supposedly. I mean, hopefully that's what most developers are trying to achieve. There's still a gap between what developers are doing, that easy access to infrastructure, and the management of all the layers in between that. Spinning up a VM doesn't mean that that's ready to be operated in production and all the security controls are in place. That's not as simple as that. Just running a container on, a cloud service doesn't mean that it's secured correctly. There's a whole other world in between those two that everybody seems to ignore.
I do think the idea of maturing and, well, I mean, we talked about it at the beginning, Mike, as more businesses put infrastructure or digital at the front of their business, and that's a core competency, how much of that is internalized? Are you a service provider to your company? Who are your vendors who are helping you do that? I think that holistic mindset is what we're all looking for, because we're all trying to deliver more value, more efficiently, more quickly, maybe even stretch the boundaries like, oops, I got to send rockets to the outer space. Like that's harder than many things, And so the kind of like seriousness of those layers, I think, is on the rise. The question I have, and I think that the reason why we're all having coffee is because we're partnering to help people do those things better, because it's really hard to go and acquire all the talent and all the skills and build all the stuff. And how do you assemble that advantage that you need so you can go do what you really do, which is send rockets to space or whatever it is that you do, make credit cards swipe or whatever, like that's your business, not all this other stuff that actually is fundamental to your business. You're just not maybe the best in the world at it. Which that's kind of a modern conundrum, I think, that we all as an ecosystem have to come in and help do everything from the racking of the servers on up, right?
Yeah, focusing on the business value, right? None of the foundation, just business value. That's where most differentiation can be added.
Well, it's getting to that point where we treat IT infrastructure, so compute platforms, the same way with plumbing or electricity coming to our homes. We just assume that it's always going to be there, always going to be on, and always going to work.
Yeah, but now you want your power to be renewable, don't you?
Well, I mean, I'm in Germany, and my power's renewable.
Well, there you go.
I'm there.
But I think these other things are being forced. I think that's actually an interesting question. I mean, one thing I love that Google did recently, as an example, is that exposed, to an end user, do you want to choose to deploy your infrastructure in a region with lower carbon footprint? That's a data center issue, actually. But it's being productized as maybe you care about this, just like you care about like placing your data at rest in a certain region or whatever else. And so the physicality is actually being pushed right on up into the API, just like we're seeing it with machine learning and in silicon, we're seeing it with location like latency and network, we're seeing it with the power source of your data center.
Basically giving those consumers more choice, more options, allowing them to be more involved emotionally in where their computer's running, as opposed to just physically involved.
Yeah.
That's an interesting perspective.
Yeah.
Well, it's true. So where do we see kind of the future of the data center? Where do we see the data center, the quote unquote data center going? 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now.
I want to add
to you. Go ahead. Go ahead.
And to add on to that question, I think what drove you, or what's driving that transition? I'd like to also know.
You want me to answer the data center question? I guess I
can. If Sean go, I have an idea.
I've also got an opinion. I'd like to hear.
I'd like all of your opinions.
So let me offer an opinion, and then Jacob can give one that's probably a bit more educated than mine. The data center, as we know it, is not going away. I mean, I think that we have to accept. There are still going to be a certain number of private data centers running very specialized systems. And by that, I mean the cloud operators, companies like Equinix, where we need systems that are not that easily made available through APIs. Although there's not a lot of that left. We're going to consume the data centers completely differently. Instead of us, each individual company, having our own data center or our own co-located space in somebody else's data center, we're going to start consuming those data centers more as commodities. They're going to be software driven by and large. I also don't think the perception of the data center is going to stay as this, as we see it today, which is this physical box of some sort that has boundaries. The data center itself we're going to lose the boundaries of the data center. You're going to start seeing more workloads being spread across different types of compute platforms. We spoke about cars. The car will become an extension of the data center rather than its own self-contained entity. Spaceships, you name it, things are going to change.
You're going to cars and spaceships, just like right away.
What's stopping this thing becoming an extension of the data center? But a much more direct, rather than an app running here that's talking to something in the back, sharing and the workload being more fluid between
the architecture. Yeah.
And I think that's going to become more crucial, especially in the short term now, as we're starting to see hardware shortages, and you're going to have to get your resources where you can, you're going to need that fix. That's
all right. Let me give you my data. By the way, as a high level, Equinix has, I don't know, close to 250 data centers. So we have a lot of them. But they're maybe different than the ones that you think about when you think data center. We're focused on regionality. So we're in like 65 cities, I think, with Mumbai now, which is like put it in the place where the people are and where the networks are. And that's the background of Equinix, which got started in the 90s, like quality, neutrality, internet exchange is the name put together. And I think proximity is going to continue to be an important thing for what we think of as traditional data center. There's obviously hyperscale data centers that are attracting all kinds of ecosystems to them. But there's still this idea of, and I think, Sean, you were talking about it, like your phone, your car, your this, your spaceship, your everything. It needs to connect. And that idea of where and how is still pretty influenced by the speed of light. And so I think that I have a question for Adam, because I know you'll be able to answer it. And this will be a leading question, but can you tell us the first 6 digits of your phone number growing up? Not the last 4, just the first 6 digits.
Growing up?
Yeah. If not, I know that Nick can, so it's cool.
I can. It's true.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so what were they?
57.
Yeah. The first 6 digits, the area code.
Oh, first 6 digits. No, I don't know the first digits.
Okay, Nick, it's up. It's your turn.
Maybe 212761.
All right. So in a traditional telecom like network before cell phones and mobile networks and all the things, that the first 3 digits represented like the city. And the next 3 was the actual central office in your neighborhood where the copper wires went. And that provided a sense of amazing locality. You could actually get your neighborhood from just those 6 digits, right?
Yeah.
Obviously now, like, I have a 267 number because I got a cell phone in college in Philadelphia. So like no one knows where but the idea that locality right now is defined like called US East is not sufficient for programmers.
Yeah.
What we need is a much richer API for these things like physicality, whether it's your data center or some other thing. Could be a computer on a telephone pole. One of my friends did the Link NYC build out in New York City. A lot of little data centers sitting in the street. And that sense of like, what is it? Where is it? What is it connected to? What's the historical like performance price stuff of it is something we could feed to software developers to like get value out of, the data center versus sort of like, it's a place, I don't think about it. We put stuff there, make sure.
It's basically defined one of the core tenets of what 5G and the 6G definition is trying to achieve.
Oh, good. Well, it's coming.
Exactly that. It's how do we define the relationship between endpoints in the network so that if I'm creating an application or if I'm defining a workload, I can understand everything from the latency between 2 points to, as I move with my device, how it interacts with each of those endpoints, how workloads can follow me around. I mean, it's exactly that. And those things we need to define.
Would it work to you? Like, I don't know, does it help you to be 1 millisecond closer or 10 milliseconds closer to something? At what cost does it? And those kind of things are hard to program right now.
Yep.
Yeah. You guys are talking right into to my view, but I'm going to answer slightly different. But I agree with everything you guys have said. I tend to see like what's driving it, what's driving the change, right? To get to that future. If you think, at some point someone coined the phrase, data is the new oil, right? The data is like king, data is exploding, right? Data is very, really valuable. But then Jacob, you just kind of touched on my point that I think the future is latency, right? If you look at the space shuttle, you look at the Tesla car, you look at your phone, right? Everything, even if you look at the history of compute from, mainframes to PCs, back to cloud, and now kind of to edge and, on body, I think it's all about latency. And like, as we do more like AI and ML and like image processing and like, self-driving cars, maybe monitoring your health, whatever, you need that latency to be like basically 0 to get a better experience. And you also probably need that compute to be as close as possible, just even for safety reasons.
You need some of it, right? And it's an architecture that's kind of pushing people. You could call it multi-cloud, you could call it hybrid, you could call it private, you could call it public, but it's kind of like gonna be a lot of those. And I like your point a lot, Adam, because it makes me think about, like we at Equinix think a lot about latency, but we usually describe it as proximity because it's like, who are you trying to talk to and connect with determines the latency. So even if you're like physically close, sometimes like you make a phone call and sometimes it has to like trombone back to like St. Louis and go over here because that's just how it works, right? And so I think we are shifting the internet kind of for the first time in 20, 25 years to be maybe beyond its kind of 16 or 18 kind of hubs that it started with, And that'll be a fascinating thing for programmers and software developers to kind of consume, is a much richer, maybe more complex internet, more decentralized, maybe.
Well, yeah. my dream future, though, is programmers don't even really need to care, right? Maybe you set, you set minimum quality of service or something, right? And that workload, like Sean was saying, gets moved around wherever it needs to be.
Yeah, business stuff.
But I think the latency and proximity, which is a great way of looking at it, is all drivers of user experience. But something else that we need to think about here as well is availability of resources in a specific region.
True.
And resources can be number of CPU cores or electricity. I mean, we saw it during the beginnings of the COVID crisis when suddenly everybody was working from home And they were struggling to get access to resources because, well, A, we were killing the internet connections that people weren't used to using.
We had a lot of ports during those couple months.
But a lot of those compute resources were in big data centers far away from where people were working. And all of a sudden, when they were used to having localized LAN connectivity, they didn't have that anymore.
Sure. Yeah, your VPN suddenly became a real problem, you know? Yeah.
And all of a sudden, we were doing more on our laptops than we were ever doing before. So...
Well, so latency, proximity, the other word I think we kind of been dancing around is like ecosystems. Like, did cloud kill data centers? I think it accelerated a move out of siloed infrastructure and siloed environments to more connected and ecosystem-driven ones. Cloud being a very rich ecosystem, each of the clouds actually, but then all of the clouds together. And I think that's what determines a lot of these things. I want access to Stripe, and I want access to my security vendor and my partners. They're everywhere. That's like one part of it. And the other ones are like, who are you trying to reach? You're trying to reach people through Verizon. You're trying to reach people through, whatever, Sean, you have in Berlin, like these are all things that determine in the end, hey, why is Uber slow today? Or what kind of, other thing I'm trying to do as a person.
So Jacob, would you say that, Kubernetes kind of bridges that gap a bit with private data center where it can kind of bring along that ecosystem, right? With the,
I think that Kubernetes, buzzword time, Kubernetes. I remember talking a lot with Dan Kahn when he was just starting the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, because same neighborhood in New York, and debating cloud native Kubernetes. Is that a word? What are we going to do? But I love it now because everyone understands it to be sort of like a control plane experience that normalizes a lot of things. And I completely agree. I mean, will there be a next Kubernetes? Of course.
Yeah.
But for now, I think Kubernetes has, there's a lot to it. It's not easy. You guys know, you run Kubernetes, for people. But the idea of Kubernetes as a sort of normalization layer that abstracts just enough, I think it's super relevant to that promise of like, put it where you need to put it and let it move at the speed it needs to move.
Kubernetes is one thing. I meant even more, I guess, like the cloud native compute foundation and the ecosystem that comes along with it, right? That, like you said, if you want payments or you want, ingress, you want whatever, right? Like just plug and play, build your own cloud, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. We have marketing talk again, but like we have a little tagline internally, which is like, your vision statement that everyone has, tattooed on your arm or whatever. And sorry, or on your coffee cup, could be your coffee cup, which is like to, that we say digital leaders will consume on demand globally from an ecosystem of providers. They'll assemble infrastructure and stuff from an ecosystem of providers. And it's that exact cloud native promise, which is like, boop, boop, boop. Some of it I created, some of it I bought, some of it's open source. And you're assembling that because you're trying to differentiate. You're trying to do something at scale. You're trying to do it differently. Yeah.
So would you consider that as a place for sort of niche providers in a world where we tend to think of, public cloud as, AWS, Google, Microsoft.
Yep.
But what about, so-called niche players?
I look at it as bell curve and non-bell curve. Like, you could call it niche, but I mean, I think like there are most businesses that are really scaled are not homogenous, right? With others. There's like, you could probably pick any two mobile carriers and their architectures and the way they do business can be very different. But how many mobile carriers are there? Like 5 in the US, 4, And so that's an example to me of bell curve versus not. And I think public cloud as it currently is, and it's evolving. So we can't just kind of say it's the way, but public cloud was designed for, I think, the 80% bell curve especially.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean that the other stuff is more niche for sure, but it's also huge. And I think it's more about like a yes and, conversation than a like either or. And that's what we have to help make possible. And even you can see with, the public clouds kind of reaching into private infrastructure in their own ways are trying to solve for that problem.
Okay. But that's an interesting one, because everything you're talking about here is this idea of, okay, having an ecosystem of SaaS companies is SaaS and I say that, SaaS providers.
As a service, right? Yeah.
If you're building out in a more traditional model where you're using containers, you're using some level of virtualization, you're putting your own software down, you're probably using one of those big three providers if you're using cloud. So do you think that the cloud providers are likely to get to the point where they will allow you to have true portability across the three different companies that are competing with each other? Or is it up to somebody else to create that abstraction layer across those cloud providers, forcing them to become commoditized?
Yes, and I mean, I don't know. I have enormous respect for the public clouds and their ability to execute and prosecute business. I mean, they're all amazing businesses. So we'll give it that. So
I'm not knocking them at all.
Wouldn't count anything out, right? But I think that there are, I forget which of our silicon friends calls it custom clouds, right? Like expertise in mobility and autonomy, expertise in media and entertainment, expertise in like the challenges that each company or industry faces. I think we'll see a lot of verticalized solutions that, maybe. I mean, look at even like Zoom. I mean, Zoom was a particular vertical until like it became a whole thing. And I think that that's an interesting kind of example of like, well, what's the infrastructure, software, and overall solution set that's going to enable that kind of vertical? And so I would think we're going to have a lot of custom clouds going forward at very big scale, and that number will grow as we find new workloads that need to suddenly be huge.
Also, answer your question, Sean. I'm going to say no, because it's like if you look at infrastructure, physical infrastructure like electricity. Do you really care where your electricity comes from? Right? No. At the end of the day, it's just like a drive to zero. Right? Like it's just the cheapest electricity you can get. So the clouds are always going to want to have differentiation and like branding and pros over others, right? So people will always be trying to build that differentiation and landing their workloads there for that specific reason. And then that's also why I think people who try to build like cloud abstractions that completely, do everything, it's really hard to do because they move quick and they're trying to add differentiation. So if you try to have like a commonality between them all, you end up with like, the lowest common denominator, and that's, you kind of lose that benefit of the differentiation that an individual cloud would offer.
Sure, but then how do you deal with? I'm sorry, Nick. How do you deal with the need for us to also diversify? So when I say us, if I was a software developer building software or architect building, designing software for a large corporate, and I have a requirement to diversify my providers for a number of reasons, everything from playing them off against each other commercially and providing me with a risk backup. Not that any of those big three are likely to fail, but anything's possible.
It's not like AWS never goes down.
Yeah, well, there's been many big occasions recently. And yeah, you could probably have a very resilient deployment in one provider. It's not typically best practice from a business point of view, amongst other things. So how do you foresee us potentially dealing with that in a world that is not just three providers, but 30, let's say 4 providers. We've got the big three, we've got an Equinix Metal, we've got Cloud VPS in Europe, we've got the EU government cloud that's also available. How do we create a commonality so that I can start to consume the most appropriate service that brings me that proximity without having to recode everything for every layer? Is the question that I was trying to get to.
Can I revise my answer to the first question in order to get to this one?
Of course.
Go for it.
So we asked that, did the cloud kill the data center? Docker's been getting a lot of shade the last couple of weeks. It's been really interesting on Twitter. I think maybe Docker killed the data center. But that sense of portability and like that, pretty big.
So containers killed the data center, basically.
It's all your fault,
not to malign Docker here, as we've got a bit of history with them.
Give them the love to Docker. Come on, right now.
Yeah, John, to answer your question, although kind of Jacob did, was, how do you do that portability? I think we kind of discussed Kubernetes could be, that's again buzzword, but that containerization and that general platform. My favorite things when people say Kubernetes is the OS of the cloud, right? Because it is that commonality layer where if you want to run workloads anywhere, first you got to get Kubernetes on, right? And there's always an option for that, and then you got that base layer.
I've got my opinion. My opinion is that people are going to build the commonality that they need. I think my feeling on the future is that you're going to have something like Kubernetes that enables you to run in multiple places. People are building to microservices architecture so that they could put, if they need a particular function from AWS, they can put it on AWS. If they need a particular function that's low latency, so they put it on Equinix. They do what they need to do, and I think that it's going to be a combination of these differentiated services with a layer on top that is built both by vendors and by the general architecture. And then ultimately, I think it will be automated to some extent by AI ops, but that's my
Well, how much does that cost? I want that one.
You just write a check. I'll put the amount.
You're working on it. All right.
There you go.
That's good. Hey, so I'm going to quote Jeff Lawson's book again. He has a great chapter. I think it's like chapter 4. I remember because I turned that page back a couple times. And it's basically the build versus buy discussion. And Nick, you touched on it there. It's just like some of which you're going to buy and some of which you're going to build. And his general, bad paraphrasing here, but general thing is like, look, if it's critical to your customer experience, you're going to have to build it in the end.
That's right. That's right.
And, I think we're all at a place now where we have, many of us have not unlimited resources. Let's put it that way. Right? We have to make decisions about what to prioritize. And that really is going to mean that we're going to bubble to the top the value that we really need to build. And there are going to be other things where we really need to buy it. And I think that idea of multi-cloud and moving things around and securing and pipelining and, just making I think Sean, you're saying just because you deployed a VM doesn't mean it's ready for production. That business value is going to be critical to a whole set of companies that are trying to start building things on top of that. And, we need to help them, buy, frankly, the tools that get them there faster. And some of them are going to eject and go start building all of it. That's just going to happen. And that's great. I think that that's a maturing of, that's a path some companies are going to get to. They're going to be major contributors to, I don't know, Lens, because they use it, And that's great. I think we'll see more companies that look like software companies, but there's just an enormous need for the next, 5-10 years, especially that cycle, as so many companies try to make infrastructure more core to their value and yet aren't hyperscalers on the side. They just aren't. And we need to help them do it.
That is a really interesting question. So you talk about companies contributing, and I'm maybe going to go down a rabbit hole here a little bit. We talk about open source and contribution to open source. And there is that big dream that more and more companies who will scratch their own itch in the open source space, and then they will provide back into the community. The reality of that, though, hasn't quite reached outside of the tech industry. We're tech companies. We have people contributing to open source every day. We own open source projects. We lead those projects. Do we really believe that non-technology companies that are on the buy track are likely to truly start contributing into open source projects as opposed to just consuming them?
You're asking, Adam, you should do this one first.
Sure. I think the answer to that is probably, to some extent, yes, right? Because another thing I like to say is that every company is becoming a software company, right? Like Jacob, you're saying, the delivery of everything is changing, right? And it's all being interconnected. It's all being driven by software, right? So it's not like just tech companies that maybe build the foundation only have smart engineers that need to get things done, right? There's going to be really, really, really smart people at everywhere, right? Like even take, for example, Tesla again, right? Or really smart cars. They use a lot of popular open source frameworks, even like Node.js, for example, right? I think for their front end interface. So if they run into a problem, right? I don't think they're gonna stand back and wait for it, right? I feel like they're going to be digging in, figuring it out, and submitting it and contributing.
More will become tech companies. Although I think an interesting question: will the kind of idealistic kind of community ethos of open source that was being born at the same time you were racking that server in South Africa, right? Will that be the way in which open source is valued going forward? I'm seeing, I agree with Adam. All leading companies will be tech companies, whether they make something physical or deliver it digitally. It's just going to happen. Just like 10 years ago, the most valuable companies in the world were energy companies. Mm-hmm. And, that's a shift and that's changing. But the idea of open source having other value, including transparency that allows for maybe even a more rigorous, stance on stability and security, right? Because there's more eyes on it, right? Like that kind of, in theory, right? Like proof is in the pudding here. But that I think there's a lot of value to open source from a couple of different angles, and it also includes just the way we work has been now defined by a sense of contributing open and pull requests and things. And so I'm pretty bullish on open source as
it's like standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Leveraging entire world's contributions, we advance as a species, right? Because if everyone had to reinvent Node.js or reinvent Linux, every single time, the productivity and advancements in technology would come to a screeching halt.
Well, I challenge every big company on this webinar right now to contribute to open source tomorrow.
There you go.
Well,
send me the links to the pull request so I can see that it's actually happening. Maybe I'll be less cynical about it.
There you go. And if you don't know how to do it, contact us and we'll show you.
That's right.
We will show you how to do it.
Yeah, get your first PR.
Do that.
Absolutely.
I've been an open source contributor for probably most of my career in some way.
Life, my friend. Yeah.
And I'm a great believer in it, and I think there is a place for it. And I think everything, honestly, is going to become open source. I mean, even the so-called closed source companies are open sourcing their code. But what is that going to mean for us in the future, and who's really going to worry about how those are integrated and managed and pulled together? Is the question that I have. Coming back to our core question about the data center, is the entire data center going to be open source? Right down to the racks that we're running things in.
You mean and into the silicon and the chips and RISC-V and everything else, right? Well, there's a great book by Nadia Ekbal, I think it's from Straight Press, called I think it's about working in the open, and the sort of culture and philosophies behind open source. It's published last year. It's a great book, and there's a lot to learn from working in the open. And I do think it does. Adam, you said lower the cost to zero at some point. We need to remove barriers to innovation that are costly for the betterment of humanity. Sorry to get idealistic, but we also need to do it for survival reasons and not just capitalistic reasons.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, which brings us to another topic that is part of this. But before I say that, I want to tell everyone. There's a 3-minute delay between what we say and what you hear. So speaking of latency, so I'm going to invite people to start throwing questions into the question pane, so that when we get to the Q&A, we'll see them, because otherwise, we'll say, hey, does anybody have any questions? And then for 3 minutes, we'll see nothing.
Speaking of latency.
Yeah, speaking of latency, but which brings us to the idea of a data center as a service. I mean, what do we think about that?
Well, I think we've been there for a while. Equinix is a data center as a service company. We help people buy data center space. But I think we're getting to this. Sean and I were talking about this before we sat down for coffee. Was the idea of what words are we saying and what do people understand them to mean? Mm-hmm. I think we're shifting. I think the words, I don't know, we could spend a lot of time talking about what we think private cloud, public cloud, hybrid cloud, multi-cloud, cloud, data centers all mean to us. But we're people have, generally speaking, sorry, Adam, gone inside of them and worked on them and touched them. And there's, that's industry lingo, right? And data center as a service, sure. Yes, everything is a service.
Yeah.
Surprised you didn't mention edge too, right? What's edge?
Yeah.
We didn't try that one on.
Because it doesn't matter. I mean, honestly, if we think about the beginning of the conversation, is yes, it's useful to have these words that we use to define things, but if we're going to start thinking about it in a more abstract way, where we're thinking more about latency, more about connectivity, more about proximity. That's a great word.
You a more architectural, more software way versus an abstracted way.
Yeah,
I mean, software naturally attracts that complexity.
It's the older question: what the hell's the difference between hybrid cloud and multi-cloud? Yeah, we can define those, and I have done in the past, but will it matter?
In your coffee cup, Sean.
Coffee cup. Otherwise, I continue drinking.
So somebody asked the question, do you think edge technology will help or hurt data centers?
I think it will force change in data centers, right? And yeah, so help, hurt, I mean, again, I think there's all kinds of shapes and sizes, locations. I think in general, like workloads are trying to find their way closer to users, and users, they're everywhere, but they're in particular places in concentration. So
I think edge will help the general public because it's going to push a lot of people to think about security, right? Right now, your workload's fairly safe running, in a data center somewhere. But as soon as that's out in the field, you have to be concerned with, has that app been changed? Has someone they have access to your API? Have they modified the app? Like, there's so many things to consider once you get outside of a data center.
Yeah,
and that's going to trickle back up, into the data center, and I think that'll make the world a better place.
Yeah, I remember we were deploying what we would call a true edge data center at a cell tower at the base of a football stadium where the New England Patriots play. And everything was looking great. We had this experiment going. It was really fun. And someone literally turned off the generator that was running the power because they thought, why did someone leave this on? And then there was monitoring alerts, sort of on-call schedules were being activated, and it was well, I guess we're going to have to think about that a little differently.
I think if you look at it now, a data center is also actually technically a single point of failure. You can argue with me about tier 4 data centers till you're blue in the face. There's always going to be some way for you to take out a single data center.
Totally.
And as compute becomes more ubiquitous, more spread, and the workloads can be more fluid across those, I think we also make the entire system more resilient in the long run. And that's what edge is going to bring to us.
And that's why we say Docker can kill the traditional data center in my mind. That sense of portability, containerization, that you can do that at much lower cost. I mean, some of it's an infrastructure question, a lot of it's a software question. And our infrastructure needs to match that software it needs to be giving it the information like Nick's phone number when he grew up. We're going to have the equivalence of that. Mm-hmm. For something like edge, I mean, especially. But I love your idea about resiliency. We did an event yesterday around blockchain and decentralization, and fascinating, with the Solana outage earlier, in the previous 2 days. Solana was one of the partners on the event, and they were talking about, how they had to get, 700 individual people to restart their network. Those were, in some ways, that's a real problem. In other ways, it's a real strength, right? They are building and trying to figure out how to run a highly independent, network. And I thought that was okay. That's putting your eggs in a lot of different baskets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if you think about that and take that one step further, and we're talking about containers now, which is, the current rage, everyone's talking serverless. What happens when we start mixing blockchain with serverless, some level of grid computing across the globe rather than a single data center? It's kind of an exciting way to look at the future.
Well, yeah, if you can move your workloads around and they can run anywhere, there'll probably have to be some type of blockchain technology to be able to verify that that's again secure and unaltered and is available to run.
You have to say the word untrusted. You just have to think untrusted naturally, and especially when you start moving, you're moving out of one place that you own to one place that someone else owns to 5 places someone else owns to 100. Yeah.
There's going to have to be hardware advancements for this too, though, right? Where people can't get access to decrypted workloads because right now, passing around keys and then unlocking things at boot, I don't think that's going to scale in the future.
There's a great old quote, and I know there's a question coming in that Nick's going to grab for us, but there's a great old quote from what's his name at Apple years ago, and it says, at some point with scale, you start to wrap the hardware around the software instead of the software around the hardware. And things like security and efficiency and whatever, they go together, and we can see that with our phones, right? I mean, it's amazing how integrated that is. I think the question is like, are the experiences that we're designing for at that kind of scale? And a lot of them aren't. A lot of them are, more 80% bell curve. And so I think we'll especially see that kind of differentiation, Adam, you were talking about, and in the data center and the hardware and the silicon and the software and everything else when we get to that other part.
Yeah.
The 30 billion IoT devices that someone's asking
so
about.
That's it. Yeah. So somebody asked, by having over 30 billion IoT devices, do you think that will help data centers? Although I think we should define help at this point, since that fast-moving secure data has to be collected somewhere.
I think it has to be connected somewhere, and I think that's where we continue to see. And there's a question in the industry right now about like, again, is the internet evolving, and when will it kind of evolve from the interconnection points, like the places where all the networks come together and exchange that IoT device traffic with, the MPLS traffic with the cloud traffic with everything else. That kind of place where everything can connect, is that shifting, and how will it shift? And I think the inevitable answer is more. I mean, we think, we see even what's happening with Starlink, and they just launched a bunch of satellites yesterday that have lasers. Just want satellites with lasers on them.
You want a white cat as well.
Exactly.
A bald cat.
And they're interconnecting with each other in space so that they don't have to do it terrestrially. And yeah, we're going to see interconnection change, but I think that's the key to things like 30 billion IoT devices, is like, where does it all kind of aggregate, connect back to each other? And is that currently, 20 or 30 places, is that going to become 1,000 places?
Yeah, I firmly believe it'll be the 1,000 places. I don't think the future makes sense to have big centralized data stores for the reasons we've discussed already. I mean, ultimately, storage is getting cheaper, smaller, faster. Networks are, and frankly, at the price it is, we can replicate almost all the data. So the data will get spread out in buckets over the world.
But we're currently in 65 metros. That's currently our definition of edge. And we'll probably need another 20 to cover real obvious gaps on the map. But like, I think we're, the internet of today, and I think Cloudflare did a great post the other day of their footprint, which they added a bunch of regional cities in Brazil and India I've never heard of. And that's like where we're going to go from a internet,
Totally.
So I'm going to remind people we only have a couple of minutes left. So if you want to ask questions, now is your chance. I'm going to ask one last question here unless something comes in, and then we're going to wrap up. So it sounds to me as though we're moving to a point where the data centers would basically be routing the data to these tiny little data centers everywhere.
As part of the architecture, completely. Yeah. I mean, I think you're going to have layers of, edge isn't just a destination. It's everyone has a different edge. Everyone has a different core. And there's going to be, Sean's making a point about the cost of data and transfer, but our systems will become architected to be efficient in utilizing the various resources that are open to them. Yeah. And there will be all of the above options.
To me, like a security camera is a good example for this, because you're not going to backhaul, live video data to a data center. But you will want to, you want to do like image processing, on a device. Maybe like if you find someone, or you send a head, or you send an alert, right? That gets backhauled, and that data gets stored. So it's gonna be like various levels.
Anonymize it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And personal privacy. Yeah. So you're not sending like real people's faces or anything. But
and what's happening on the device? The devices are getting smarter. What's happening at the metro edge, the regional edge, the last mile network, blah blah blah.
Just look at home automation systems. I happen to use an Apple home automation solution. I have a couple of home pods around and a couple of Apple TVs. If I kill one of them, the system the control components just moves around between them. They follow me around the room, around the house.
They're listening to you right now, Sean.
They're listening to us right now. But
it's like,
use that as an analogy to what's possible at a larger scale. If we can solve some of the security challenges, then for sure.
All right. So I don't know whether we're going to get disconnected in 15 seconds or not. If we are, I'm going to say thank you to everyone. If not, let me just go with a quieter, more graceful ending. I would love for everyone to put it, throw in the question pane any topics that you'd like to see us cover, any people that you would like to see us have on as guests in the future. In the meantime, I want to thank our guests here, Jacob Smith from Equinix, and of course our regulars, Sean O'Mara and Adam Parko from Mirantis. I am Nick Chase. I want to invite you to come next time, next month, where our topic will be porting applications from legacy systems to cloud. Is it worth it? So please join us next time. We appreciate you all, and join us next time. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you then.
Thanks, guys. Thanks,
all right. Thank you all, everyone. It's been a great conversation. Thanks a lot.
See you, everyone.
Bye-bye.